guys, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I interview Manoj from Monash Health. He's a practicing doctor at Monash Health, and we're going to discuss what it was like to get into med school, what it was like in med school, and what you can do to get into med school as a mature age student. Likewise, we go through the challenges he faced during med school itself. So, if you find this video useful, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and give me a thumbs up. Well, Manoj, first of all, thank you for being on my podcast. In our podcast, we're going to discuss a little bit about your career and how you've faced all the challenges that you've faced throughout your career. But in order to give the listener a little bit of an understanding about, give us a little bit of a background about yourself. Tell us a little bit about where you studied, what you studied, and where you are sort of right now. Where did you go through your studies?
Yeah, no stress. I grew up and I went to primary school and high school in the southeast suburbs in Melbourne. And I graduated from school and went straight into undergrad medicine at Monash University. Essentially, it's a 5-year long course, and I extended it by 1 year to do an honours year as well. Upon completing that last year, I've just now started work as a doctor at Monash Health. And that's a very, very brief overview, I guess, of my professional history. And then I guess alongside all of that, I've been involved in quite a few projects and I guess groups at uni as well. But I think the main thing right now that I'm still very involved in is I run a company called Keep It Simple Academics. That's essentially an Australia-wide tutoring platform. And we started a couple of years ago, and it's been growing over the last 2 years. And I kind of do that on the side right now as well. So that's a very brief overview of everything that I've done.
Awesome. And I look forward to at the end of it going through that Keep It Simple academics, and we'll give the listeners some information about that as well, definitely. So if we go all the way back to when you started studying, you said you went to school in the southeastern suburbs?
Yeah.
And what kind of area, how would you describe that area, the southeastern suburbs, to a listener that doesn't kind of know where Melbourne is? Is it a sort of a higher affluent area? Is it a working class area? Start with things like that.
No, yeah. It was, I think now it's probably gentrified a bit, but 20 something years ago, it was very much so where a lot of families would migrate coming from, China, from Sri Lanka, from India. So a lot of that community is probably made up of a lot of migrant families, and my parents were some of them. So my parents were from Sri Lanka. They moved to Australia, and I was born at Clayton Monash Medical Center, which is where I'm now working. So it's almost like coming full circle. But I grew up in that area. I went to primary school at just one of the local primary schools there. And then I went to high school in Keysborough at a school called Haileybury. And yeah, that's kind of the area. It's very much so a lovely area. I'm a big fan of the southeast suburbs in Melbourne. It's where I grew up, and it's changed a lot over the last 20 years. It definitely was kind of on the outskirts of Melbourne almost back then. But now, as Melbourne's slowly kind of crawling outwards further and further, it's become a bit busier. Some, lots of development occurring in that area, and it's changing very quickly.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Now, in high school itself specifically, how did you find that? Did you always find out that you were kind of the student that studied the most? Were you able to sort of pick up the information quickly, or did you kind of struggle a bit and you had to put in those extra hours?
I think that I was very up and down during school. So in primary school, I started to, I guess, is when studying became a thing. My parents, being migrant parents, really, encouraged me to work hard, to study a lot, apply for scholarship testing, all of that kind of stuff. And eventually I got to high school, and it was a pretty big transition going from just a small local primary school to a much larger high school. It was a very competitive environment, but obviously in that kind of environment, you get to enjoy yourself. You're surrounded by a lot of interesting, intelligent people, and it was around then where I feel like I started to take my work a bit more seriously. I was surrounded by very intelligent students as well. And I definitely saw my scores go up and down throughout the years in, years 7 to 12 when I was in high school. But then I kind of pulled through in year 11 and 12 at the end of the day. So it was a bit up and down, but I think that I definitely kind of matured and worked quite hard in the final years of my high school. And I think that overall, I was definitely a student who tended to pick things up reasonably quickly, but I definitely had very particular strengths and weaknesses. And then at the same time, I also needed to work very hard in order to kind of compete in such a competitive school. And so I think that in years 11 and 12, I worked extremely hard in order to perform well and in order to kind of get kind of the scores that I did so I could get into university, into medicine, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Now, just to give the listener an indication of just how hard it is to get into medicine specifically, is it accurate for me to say they only take pretty much the top 1% of grades within the state in order to qualify to get into medicine? So it is quite a very high bar to get into medicine specifically.
Yeah, they definitely consider a few things, because for medicine, they consider things like a clinical aptitude test alongside your ATAR, as well as an interview. So they consider a few things. But overall, I guess from an ATAR perspective, which is kind of your final high school grade, it is very much so. You have to be scoring 99 and up to kind of guarantee a spot in medicine. But obviously there are exceptions. There are some students who perform extremely well in interviewing or clinical aptitude tests, and then it kind of balances out into the top kind of echelon of students there.
Right. So just on that, that's actually a very interesting point. So yes, you need to get good grades to get into medicine. But if, say, you don't get into that top 1% or that 99%, there is still avenues to get through to medicine in terms of studying medicine, depending on things like your interview and your social skills and your aptitude effectively. It's obviously not the most easiest path, but it's not always a shut door.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, after that, there are plenty of students who apply and get into medicine at a postgraduate level. It's really just for undergraduate, where I guess your high school scores and that kind of thing really matters and makes a difference. Whereas from a postgraduate level, it's more so your university performance.
Yeah, okay. So that's a very interesting point, because one of the things I'd like to always just highlight to people, and it's very important, you're kind of in high school, you're 18, 19 years old, and tell me you're the doctor. Is your brain fully formed at that age for a male? And
no, definitely not for male.
yet you're expected to figure out what you want to kind of do in year 12 for the rest of your life. So if you don't necessarily get that correct, by all means, the answer isn't don't study hard, don't be lazy. It's not that. But if you don't necessarily get through to the pathway that you want, and medicine is something that you kind of learn later on in your career, something of interest, there are still pathways to get through. Is that a fair characterization, do you think?
I think that's something that's definitely overlooked by a lot of students in high school, the fact that for almost any career, there are multiple pathways to get there, and there are a multitude of ages at which you can be accepted into different industries, different degrees, and that kind of thing. So there's definitely people who started their medical degree in their mid-30s after doing something else completely different initially earlier on in their life. So there's nothing stopping you from changing course, and I think that's definitely important to note. But as you said, it's also important to definitely build that work ethic while you're younger, because even though there are multiple pathways, the one thing that you almost universally will need is kind of the drive to excel, to stand out, and to really be your best self, which is, I guess, universal across all jobs. So I think it's important to really emphasize to people that there are always multiple pathways to do what you love, but it always takes a lot of work no matter what pathway you choose. There's no silver bullet.
Correct. And so you may, for example, you may have that talent, you might have that natural talent where you can actually pick things up quite simply, and you got to get things done. Now, I've in my career as well, and in terms of my work life as well, I've met a lot of talented people. However, I've also met a lot of talented people that didn't apply their skill. And that work ethic that you're talking about is actually a critical thing that I find the difference between people that are kind of successful in, and when I define success, I mean it's you getting what you want out of life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Not necessarily you becoming a doctor or a nurse or a lawyer or whatever. It's what you getting what you want out of life. And basically not. I think talent helps, but the hard work and ethic is what will actually get you across the line.
Yeah, exactly.
On that point as well, you were saying as well, you sort of got into is it safe to say that you sort of got into a group of people that were a little bit competitive and you kind of all studied together? Were you in like a social group that kind of studied, it was kind of that work ethic was kind of built into that social group?
I like to think that when I was in high school, I was definitely kind of friends with everyone. I wouldn't say that there were specific kind of groups that I necessarily tried to, be part of. But overall, I was lucky in the sense that I went to a school that was very competitive. They had a lot of like scholarship intake students in year 7. They had a lot of students who are, high performers, and the school really nurtures that. So I think I was definitely very lucky in the sense that I was accepted into that school. And I just happened to be surrounded by a lot of kind of high performing students. And I think that it's definitely a benefit, but it doesn't kind of, if someone isn't in that environment, it doesn't completely detriment them in the sense that they can still, perform and work hard. But being in an environment of people who also want to achieve similar things makes it kind of more makes it not necessarily easier, but more socially acceptable to kind of work hard, to study hard, to focus on that kind of thing. So I think that I was very blessed that I went to the school that I did, and I was surrounded by the people that I was surrounded by. But I think that if you were to put me in another school, another environment, I'd like to think that I'd still try and work as hard and just apply myself to what I'm doing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the key takeaway from that is nothing takes away from hard work, which we kind of discussed. Yeah. However, environment does play a bit
Environment does play a role, exactly.
Definitely. And even if you're not in an environment where you have those sort of capabilities, you have that sort of that peer group support structure, you can always find that structure as well. So you can always seek out, there's always going to be someone in every demographic, in every school, which you align with, and you're both on the same sort of pathway. So I think one thing I always harp on about people is if you want to get something done and you don't know what to do it, go find out other people who are actually trying to do the same thing as well and learn from each other, help each other, push each other. That's a good pathway to sort of grow fast and rapidly.
Exactly. I agree completely. I think environment is definitely something that has a big influence on how you're able to perform. I mean, I've studied at a library, I've studied on a bus, and I can tell you, like, it's much easier studying in a library. And similarly, I've been to the gym alone, I've been to the gym with a gym partner. And once again, having that kind of motivation is completely different. And I think that environment does play a big role, and trying to surround yourself or put yourself in the right environment does make a big impact on your final outcomes, and if you're trying to achieve whether or not you achieve what you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. I think that is a critical thing. And now, one thing that you just said as well, which I find actually quite important as well, you went to the gym with a partner and you went to the gym alone. I think as a person, environment, we're all saying yes, find the right environment, but you also should learn that capability of, okay, I can't find the right peer group right now, so I don't just stop.
Exactly.
You've actually got to be able to do it yourself as well. I think that's a bit of resilience that everyone should learn.
Yeah, I think that environment is maybe used, this might be a bit controversial, but environment is maybe used a little bit too often as an excuse in order to kind of explain why something didn't work out. Whereas I found when I was in high school, if I was time poor because of family things, because of being busy with extracurriculars at school, like there's nothing stopping you from, I would quite literally print out like essays and just sit on the bus and do them on the bus because I just wouldn't have any other time throughout the day. And I think that environment is definitely a big factor in achieving your outcomes, but it's not, it can be overcome even if you don't have the optimal environment.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you mention that, because I have a group of friends. I've got a ton of people, and the amount of times, these people have obviously worked their way up and everything, and the amount of times that these people have, for example, said to me, oh, if only I had someone to train with, I could go to the gym with. And obviously getting a little bit older, the kilos start piling on a little bit as well. And it's the key message I always try to tell everyone is, you've just got to make time. You're just going to have to do it. You might not have someone to go to the gym with, or someone to go for a ride with, or a run with. You're just going to have to get up every morning and then go out and train by yourself. That may be the solution that you may have to do. So that's a very critical part on that. And what I'll do is we'll summarize some of these key points on the video as part of what we do. So I think that was a great summary about how you sort of progress through your studies and your learnings through high school itself specifically. So after that point, so you've done the 40-hour weeks of studying whilst going to school and everything. You're reading on the bus, not in the library, but on the bus, on the way to the library. You've done all the hard work. You've got into med school finally. You finally got into med school. What was that first year like compared to year 12?
It was once again a step up. So what I've kind of noticed from my transition from primary school to high school, then high school to medicine, every step up has kind of surrounded me with a group of people who are even more high performing, even more competitive. And the transition from high school to medicine was a pretty big shock. And I think the reason for that was because you take all of the smartest, nerdiest kids from high school and you put them in one place. It's going to be a very, very high performing, very intelligent group of people. And I think that was a big shock for me, because you go from being, at the upper end of kind of the academics at your high school to maybe the middle or the lower end in med school. So I think that it's a very crazy transition going from high school to med school. But once again, I think the change of environment is amazing. Being surrounded by people who are like-minded, who are studying the same degree after the same thing, interested in very similar things, but also very interesting individually in their own right, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very interesting thing that you mentioned there, in terms of, if I was to summarize that in a little bit, you went from, say you were in that top 1% in high school. You're now in a group full of all those other one percenters. Now, your goal now is not just to be the 1%, but you've got to now be the 1% within the 1%.
Within the 1%, exactly. So
it's a very big step up in terms of that capability that you have to grow with, and you want to sort of stay in line with your your peers, and you want to grow with them. So that environment, it kind of just concentrates that ability to grow and learn and everything like that. Now, I'll give you an interesting anecdote about that. It happens in a lot of people's careers as well, specifically, especially when people change industries as well. So that stress that you face, you can go from one industry to another, and you could have been an absolute expert in one industry and you had a massive passion for another industry. When you jump ship, that challenge that you face is exactly the same. You went from being the expert in this area, you go to a new area where everyone knows everything about what you're talking about, and you're at the bottom of the rung, and you've just got to handle that stress and push the way through. Do you want to give me some of those strategies? What did you do differently in that first year of university to sort of manage that stress? What did you do in terms of the number? Did you increase the number of hours that you were studying? Did you kind of study smarter? Was there any particular strategies you implemented?
I think one important thing before going on is to just accept the change in environment, and that you are in a very competitive group. As you said, there was a period of time where I think Michael Jordan went from playing basketball to trying out baseball and was very average at baseball. And as you said, it's very similar when you're transitioning like horizontally as well as vertically in your career, where you go into kind of maybe the next level almost. And at that level, you might be starting out at the very bottom. And number one is just accepting that and not placing too much pressure on yourself, because just like, any kind of transition, you're not going to start off at the very top. And you do have to accept that you might need to work your way up. You might need to become more confident over time and build up your abilities and your skills again. So I think that acceptance is very important, because it's very easy to transition into that environment and feel a ton of imposter syndrome, feel like you don't belong in medicine, feel like you're too dumb to be in medicine, where at the end of the day, you're really, still the top performers across, the entirety of the country at one of, the most competitive medical schools. But at the end of the day, there are some people who still feel like they don't belong there because they, don't deserve it. So I think accepting it is very important. And then after that, it's really about, building building relationships with the people around you, getting into that kind of transition and embracing it and accepting that it'll take some time, but that you will eventually kind of be able to learn the ropes and, I guess, level up.
And very importantly, don't quit in that process. That process is painful, I guess, for anything that you do in that life. And that example with Michael Jordan is a critical one. I think that was Michael Jordan went from the pinnacle. For all the young kids who don't know who Michael Jordan is, he's better than LeBron James. But he went from the pinnacle of basketball, and then he went to sort of a low. He didn't even make the major leagues in terms of.
Oh, he didn't. Yeah.
Baseball as well. So he went from the pinnacle to another, and he just practiced. And I remember in that documentary about, I think it was The Last Dance.
Yeah.
They were telling Michael, they said, look, you may need to train in such a way that you can never play basketball ever again. He said, yeah, that's fine. I'll do what it takes to be good at what I do. And I think that is the key lesson to everyone. Don't stress out. Don't give up. Know it's painful. Accept it's painful. I think that's a key message that you're saying. Accept the pain and sort of develop and adapt and sort of engage the people around you and become part of that new community. And it takes time. That's the critical thing as well. So that whole thing that you were mentioning about imposter syndrome, you gave me deja vu from every new job I've had in my entire career.
Exactly, yeah.
You go to a new job and you're like, why am I here? These people are so much smarter than me. I don't know what I'm talking about. And then give it 6-12 months and you're sort of at that level with everyone else. Then you're adding value, developing and all that sort of stuff. So that's a critical thing. Now, back to your time at med school as well. Everyone wants to study medicine. Everyone wants to get into medicine. It is very hard to get into. We've discussed pathways to get in there if you maybe change your career aspects throughout life. You're obviously working hard in there. What is it like actually in med school? What is med school? What are the contact hours like? How much sleep are you running on in that? What's it like in year 1, year 2 compared to, is it year 3 and year 4 we were actually out doing clinical things?
Yeah, so years 1 to 2 are based at uni, and then the rest of your years are based at hospitals.
And what are those hours like in hospitals? Are they literally like the ER, the TV show ER, where you're doing 30-hour weeks, 40-hour weeks, plus you're studying, all that? Just give us an example of what one of your rotations were like.
I think that one of the misconceptions about med school is that it's very kind of unsupportive, a very brutal place. I think definitely the most difficult part of med school is getting in. Getting in is extremely competitive. But once you're in, the good thing is that everyone is on the same side. And I think it's a symptom of Australia's system in the sense that if you go to medical school as an Australian citizen, you are guaranteed a job at the end of the day. Whereas in a lot of other degrees, you obviously have to compete towards the end of your degree for those internships and things like that. In Australia, it's a little bit different. So when you get into med school, no matter how difficult academically it is and how grueling the hours may be, everyone is there to support each other. Everyone's on the same side. Everyone's sharing notes and resources. So I think I was definitely surrounded by some of the, most intelligent, but also friendliest, loveliest people. And that definitely makes med school more bearable. I know that for people who try and get in, postgrad and undergrad, the act of getting into medicine can be very cutthroat, can be very difficult. But once you're in, the environment is very supportive. And while the hours can be long, you always have someone by your side. You always have people to debrief with and talk to and to study with. Everyone has a study group. So I think that one of the misconceptions is kind of how brutal med school in Australia is after you get in. It's difficult. There are long hours, but you do have a lot of support, and then you still have time to live your life outside of medicine.
That's a critical thing. See, from the outside looking in, that's not the conception that we get, but what you're saying is there's really sort of that, I wouldn't say it's a bubble environment, but it's a very supported environment where people are out to help you. And just reflecting on that comment right now is, I always have this belief that you don't get into medicine to become rich, right? You get into medicine to help people. You want to, cure cancer or whatever disease or affliction and it kind of makes sense that once people are in there, you see people kind of struggling, and that sort of that care side of the reason why you get into med school kind of comes out, and then you kind of help each other get in. So the key focus, I would say, is to anyone then trying to get into medicine, maybe even if it's a postgrad thing, really, really focus on sort of the aspects of what you need to do to get in, and don't stress. You know how we have a tendency to look out too far and say, I won't be able to get in, and even if I do get in, then I've got the kids to look after now, I've got a mortgage to pay. There's always a way around how you can manage those skills, and there will be a supported environment there for you to help each other out. Is that a fair characterization or is that a great summary of what you just said?
I think that's very fair, exactly.
Throughout that process, obviously, it's competitive to get in, so you're in now. You're in that nice environment and you're supported, people help each other, it's hard work, all that sort of stuff. Did you have were there any moments, I remember definitely my university day, there was, you think it's the end of the world, but there's moments like, I've got this assignment due, it's a moment of crisis where something is going to happen. And maybe you do fail a subject or something like that. Did you have any critical moments of crises like that during the whole med school process?
Yeah, there are definitely very kind of large exams, and there are also very, grueling periods of time. I think as a uni student, almost everyone leaves things to the last minute. And there are times where, you're a few weeks away from an exam and everything is going crazy. You've barely got enough time to sleep or eat. That's definitely happened quite a few times. I think that at the end of the day, really, once again, I think it's kind of common for med students, everyone's a very academic person and kind of, accustomed to that situation almost. Like everyone knows how to sit down, get their work done, that kind of thing. And I think there were definitely some kind of, crisis periods, but now looking back, I think it felt like a crisis in the moment, but now it feels like very, like a very minor kind of blip.
Yeah, can we get into that? Because it's one thing I want to actually just really focus on, and this is one of the things I want to just explain to a lot of people. There have been times in my life, especially in university days, where you think, all right, I've got to get this assignment in. If I don't, I'm going to fail this subject. And let's look at the worst case scenario in them. You do all the work, you submit your assignment, you fail the subject. Your life doesn't end. It just does not end. You're looking back retrospectively, at the time it's quite stressful, but your life doesn't end. You always can have another go. As long as you don't give up on something or you don't quit. I remember, times in my university days specifically where there was actually one subject that I did fail, and at the time it was like the end of the world, but you go retake that subject and then you go from the bottom of the class to the top of the class and kind of, One thing I noticed as well is on average, I probably if you average out the marks on those two subjects with the fail and the high mark, you probably got a better mark on average than you would have got in the first place if you just scraped across the line. So
Yeah.
events and crises like that, I guess the key message here to any student or anyone who's in sort of one of those situations is don't panic. Work hard, of course. It's not the end of the world. There is always other options and other avenues. And even if you have to do it again, hey, it might be a great learning lesson. You may learn something the second time around.
Yeah, exactly. I think that it's difficult to not panic in a situation like that, but you can almost reassure yourself by thinking in 1 year's time, in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time, this is not going to really matter at all. So it's very easy to get caught into things. And I think that feeling a bit of panic and stress is human, but always remember that it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an absolute great message. So on that, let's lead a little bit into, okay, so you've done your 4 or 5 years in university. You've been through a few crisis moments. You went from high school where you're the top of the bunch, and then you go to med school where you start at the bottom, and then is it safe to say over time you sort of work your way up the pack to, be maybe not the 1% within the 1%, but you're in a very exclusive group. You might be up the top end again. You're studying, you're learning new things. You've done your couple of years of rotations, you've met patients and all that, and then bang, you go straight into work. What was that first year of work like? This is a key thing I like to emphasize. Do you think the transition, especially for medicine, so do you think the transition was easier for medicine because you did the last couple of years inpatient? Or was it still an absolute shock when you've got an actual patient in front of you and you've got all the knowledge that you've learnt and everything, you've got to sit down with this person, you've got 10 minutes? Is that you've got 10 minutes and you've got to diagnose this person? Tell me what that experience is like.
Yeah, well, I think, so I'm currently, week 4 of being a doctor now. So it's still very, very early days. And I think that the transition is somewhat made easier by the fact that you've spent a lot of time in hospital. But the one thing that really changes everything is, I guess, the responsibility. You're almost free of responsibility as a medical student because you're not making any important decisions. But then suddenly you are in an environment you're quite familiar with, but you have that weight of every decision you make. And I think that has been a very kind of jarring thing over the last few weeks. Yep. But you slowly start to build your confidence, lose the imposter syndrome, and it's a slow process, but it does happen, week by week. Yeah,
that makes sense. So just to circle back on that point as well, when you're in year 3, so how long is med? My understanding is 5-6 years. Is that correct?
So it depends. From an undergrad, it's a minimum of 5 years. Yeah.
And the last, so year 4 and year 5, you're in hospital, is that correct?
Yeah, and years 3, 4, and 5 for me varies between med schools, but yeah, years 3, 4, and 5 for me were in hospitals.
Perfect. Now, in those 3, 4, 5 years, effectively, you're on rotation. You're with a doctor, I assume, or a medical professional who ultimately, is it safe to say they have to sign off on everything that you kind of do, suggest, recommend? Kind of, there is that sort of hand-holding in a sense, which makes, we're not trying to say they're not unqualified. It's not a lack of qualifications. It's just that the experience isn't there yet to be able to make that diagnosis, to treat that patient. So there is someone that finally signs off on everything you do?
Yeah, so I think in your final year of med school, you have quite a lot of independence and you're doing things by yourself. But finally, at the end of the day, someone's always there to sign off on the decisions and make some recommendations, do some teaching, give you advice. And that's probably the biggest transition. Like you do definitely have people you can reach out to for advice when you're working as well. And there's always a lot of support, but you have the ability to make decisions when you need to.
Perfect. And then literally a week later, so just on that actually, before we get to that week later, what is it like when you finished sort of your med school, and you say there's a guaranteed job, but I assume there is still an interview process you need to go through depending on what location you get. How does that process start?
So it's kind of halfway through your last year of med school. You have to apply for different hospitals and then you go through an interview process. And it's pretty standardized for most of Victoria. And I think it's quite similar in other states as well. Although in Victoria, I think in other states across Australia, it's more of a randomized process. Whereas in Victoria, you have to apply and choose what hospitals you want to apply for.
Gotcha. In that process, so is it just is it a one-on-one interview, or is there a couple of rounds? How does that sort of work out?
There's usually a couple of rounds, yeah. It can depend on where you apply and what hospitals you apply to. But in a lot of cases, it might just be an online interview or some pre-recorded questions, something along those lines.
Perfect. And generally, how did you find that you went in interviews? Because where I started with this whole career side of this was interviews was something I struggled with my whole sort of career, but I found that I was actually quite good at them. So I used to panic before them. What sort of prep work would you do before an interview? Did you know kind of what kind of questions you were going to be asked, or what sort of prep would you do before an interview?
There's definitely some information regarding what to expect, but it's quite difficult to know exactly what you're going to get hit with. For medicine, as I said, there's not too much pressure on the interviews. It's obviously very high stress doing any interview, but at the end of the day, you are going to get a job in Australia as an Australian citizen and a med student. It's a little bit different, I think, for international students, where it can be a bit more competitive. But at the end of the day, you know you have a job. So I think that the interview process is quite grueling and it can be very nerve-wracking. But you know that at the end of the day, even if you don't perform at your best, you will be able to still, become a doctor. Yeah. You're not going to be stopped from doing that because you've passed all your exams, you're competent, you've passed your competency tests, that kind of thing. The interview might go well, might not go well. For me, I think the interviews went relatively well, but it's very difficult to know. They don't give you much feedback afterwards. You don't know why one hospital might have given you an offer, why another one might not have. So it's a bit difficult for me to comment because the process for applying to hospitals is very, very different from, I guess, corporate internships and that kind of thing.
No, that's very interesting. And I think a key point there is, I think if you've done the work in the past, I guess in medicine, you still got to perform in an interview. You always have to perform in it. You can't, rock up unshaven or whatever. Yeah. All those things, all those critical things matter and they're important and all that sort of stuff. But there is a little bit of that pressure off because if you're an Australian citizen, you study medicine in Australia, especially maybe Victoria, you're kind of going to get through because you've done all that work.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Exactly.
That's a great insight into something even I didn't even know about medicine itself. So that's always it's always good to learn how other industries kind of do their interview process. And just for any advice for anyone who's prepping for an interview, what would you say?
I think that at the end of the day, as someone who's run interviews for Keep It Simple and been on the other side, been on the hiring side, I think that the thing that you really look out for is to kind of see, you really want to look out for candidates who differentiate themselves from the pack in some kind of way. And that's very true at a resume level, as well as at an interview level. And it can be hard and it can take some time to kind of work out exactly what that might mean. And I think it varies a lot between different industries. For example, I think for creative marketing jobs, obviously you're looking for someone who has that flair, whereas for jobs that are for as someone who's hired programmers before, for example, you're looking for a very different set of skills and a very different personality. But I think at the end of the day, what you're trying to convey is that you know your stuff and that you're the right person for the role, and also just knowing the company. I think that understanding and having a good understanding and grasp of all of those skills that are necessary for your role is important, but then it's very easy to add that little extra sprinkle on the top by being familiar with how the company runs, and providing some insights and value from that standpoint that are kind of tailored to the interview.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point that you mentioned there. One of the critical things that I always tell anyone doing an interview is make sure you've done company research. I think if you haven't done company research, you are well behind the pack. I almost would, being on the other side of the fence as well, I've had candidates from overseas who have applied, and I could tell you right now, they knew our industry, they knew a little bit about the company, they knew how things work, and they were telling us about what we do, and I was blown away. So I think that critical thing about, do some company research, have that flair. Back to your question about having the skill set. So if you're looking for a creative person, and tell me if this is something that appeals to you as an employer, because it's something I actually look out for as well. I also look for like a cross application of skills. So what I mean by that, I almost say if you go for a creative job, I almost kind of expect you to have a bit of flair. You have to be able to do that creative side of your business and all that. And there's a little bit of a difference to you that differentiates you. I think that's they're the first set of ticks that I go through. But tell me about this as well. And this is something I always tell people as well. If you are creative, maybe if you focus on, and I don't mean this is 100% of your job, but if you can learn a little bit of that technical side of the role as well, where you can learn to speak a bit of jargon, understand what the technical, do you find that that's a massive advantage for someone that you're looking for as well?
I think it really depends on what you as an employer are looking for. I think for me, when I'm looking for, when I've hired for creative roles, I think I'm really looking for someone who's a risk taker.
Yeah.
And that's probably something that's unique to me and my company and what I'm looking for. And I think it does vary a lot depending on what your company you're applying to. Whereas maybe, for example, if you're applying for a large creative firm that's very professional, has big clients, they might be looking for someone who's very professional. Whereas if you're applying for a startup that's looking for someone who can do some guerrilla marketing, they might be looking for someone who's a risk taker, who can really be kind of left of field, try some interesting ideas out. So at the end of the day, the best thing that I say is kind of along the lines of what you were saying, know the company, but really at the end of the day, it kind of distills down to know your audience. So if you know who's going to be on the other side, who's interviewing you, and you know what they'll likely be looking for, you should cater your application to that. So if you're applying for a startup, for example, a creative role versus a large professional agency, you should tailor things very differently.
I think that is a very critical point that you've actually mentioned on that. And I actually work at a startup myself, believe it or not. So as part of a startup, you're not given a task list to say go through step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then do these other ones and these ones and these ones. It's pretty much, here's a goal that you need to do, get us there. And you're not going to have that oversight of someone looking over your shoulder telling you, no, don't do it this way. You really need that sort of that risk taker approach that you're talking about. So if your personality sort of suits that risk taking approach, maybe some people, startups may actually be an opportune, you've got like an interest in an industry, maybe look down that startup avenue in that industry. Whereas where I find it, and tell me if you find the same thing, if it's a large corporate, it's quite structured in what this department does this, and that's all they do. So if you like that structured sort of that, I would say almost that 9 to 5 work, I know you've got to work hard in large corporates as well. I'm not trying to discount any of that. And your sort of personality sort of is tuned to that, or you want to focus on things like that. Maybe that is an aspect that people can look at in their careers as well as they head down that path as well. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
I think that's very fair. Yeah, I think that applying for smaller companies, for startups versus for larger corporations, at the end of the day, the big difference is really how much responsibility and initiative you take. And as you said, the biggest difference from the actual company's perspective is that at a startup, you're much more likely to be given a goal with less instructions, whereas at a large company, it's much more likely that you'll be given a set of instructions, and they'll know the goal.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there is one thing I will maybe disagree with you on, one little slight thing. One thing for anyone that's in a very technical role about that cross skill set. If you're in an extremely technical role where you have to actually, maybe coding as a classic example, having the social skills and the ability to actually interpret what the person you're speaking to
Exactly. Yeah.
is an absolute game changer, I would say.
Yeah.
You could probably say you've got a list of coders from 1 to 10, all right? And 1's the best. You might take a 4 if they can interpret the requirements from an actual... so I think those social skills in those extremely technical roles is sometimes worth a little bit more than taking the best coder in the room who write the most efficient code, because you'll get a better outcome ultimately.
I think I 100% agree. And I think at the end of the day, once again, the employee or the applicants need to understand their audience. And then from an employer standpoint, they need to know what kind of hire they're looking for. So as you said, if you're looking for someone who's a programmer who needs to be very client facing, it's much more important for them to have that personable and the ability to understand what a client wants from a product. So I think at the end of the day, it's very difficult to generalize, but the overall kind of advice you can give to people applying for jobs is really think about who your audience is.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a key takeaway from that. Now, if we can just go back into the medicine side, and we'll get some time because I want to go through this KSI academics, and I want to do a bit of a deep dive in that. So we've got about 10 minutes, which I'd like to go through that in a bit more detail. But back to medicine. So a couple of questions that I've had about medicine, and clear this up as well. As once you finish your medical studies, is there a requirement that you need to work remotely?
It depends on your initial contract for medical school. That's kind of the key differentiator. So there are some people who are on what's called a bonded contract that requires them to do a little bit of time rurally, whereas there are other med students who are on kind of a Commonwealth supported program whereby they don't have that requirement to work rurally. So it really depends. For doctors who are expats who are coming to Australia and want to start practicing in Australia, there's usually a requirement as well to do some work rurally. So there are quite a few options, but there are some scenarios where you might be required to work in a rural or regional town.
Gotcha. What's the key differentiator so if you're going straight from sort of high school to med school, what's the key differentiator in being sort of on one of those bonded contracts? Is it international students? Is it more, do you have to pick, or is it a certain class of medicine, or is it certain universities? Is there a key differentiator, or do you get to choose, I guess?
I think it's very much so based on kind of the demand. So I think that for a lot of people prefer the freedom of being able to choose. So those unbonded programs tend to require slightly higher marks, whereas your bonded and rural programs might not require that level of marks. But then again, it's very difficult to say. It changes year on year, and each of these programs has its own positives and negatives. So there might be reasons why you'd want to go rural because it might have its own benefits. So I think it's very difficult to generalize as to, whether one is better than the other. It really depends on what you're looking for.
And it's a demand supply kind of thing that you're saying. So it's not necessarily, it's not an easier pathway necessarily to be on a bond. It's basically depending on the supply within that marketplace at the time.
I mean, I guess in a way, I think that in general, people like the freedom to be able to choose where they work. Yeah. And I think that because of that, people tend to prefer and preference Commonwealth supported programs where they have that freedom, and then they might have bonded or rural options as their second or third options.
Yeah, gotcha.
So it really depends on, I guess, how you order your preferences when applying to medical school. Whereas some people might preference going rural as their first best option.
Yeah, I gotcha. So just remind the viewer and everything. It's been let's just say there's a reason I have no hair. There's been a few years since I've been in high school, but just remind in terms of preferences. How many preferences can you select in terms of after your ATAR, after year 12? Is it 3 preferences that you pick?
You can pick quite a few. I think it's usually around 8 to 12. I'm not exactly sure. It varies quite a bit based on the state you're in and the system that you're going through. Um, and it also depends on what kind of options are provided by the medical schools. For example, for Monash, the medical school that I went to, there were 3 types of contract. There was a Commonwealth supported program, there was an extended rural cohort program, and there was a bonded program, and you could preference each one of them as a line in your university preferences in whatever order you chose. And I think a lot of people I know, so once this is just an anecdote that's not based on any solid data, but most people would preference a Commonwealth supported place because then you have the freedom to choose where you'd like to work. And a lot of people would preference that because if you want to go rural, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. And then some people in other situations would preference rural because that would provide them with some benefits. Maybe they're from a rural community and they'd like to go back home, that kind of thing. So it very much so depends.
I think that is a great summary of how that application process works and some of the motivations behind it. And there is obviously an element of demand and supply, but and freedom that sort of gets priced into that as well. Now, I think that's been a great summary about medicine, about your experience, your journey, and love to have you back on here and maybe in a year or two you tell us what you've learned, what you think is different. Love to learn a bit more about that. Now, I'd really love to have a discussion about what is KSI Academics, and if you could just give me a quick overview of what KSI Academics is, why you started KSI Academics, and how do you find that transition between sort of being an employee, where you do have a lot of autonomy, obviously as a doctor, but being an entrepreneur and your own adventure, and tell me what that difference in freedom, or if there is freedom or not. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so it's KIS Academics, keep it simple academics. And essentially what it is it initially started off as a company between a friend and I that was focused on kind of tutoring. And it started off as a bit of an experiment, something we just did in our spare time. And at this point, it's kind of grown a bit past that. We've grown across Australia. We've got a really strong team of tutors, and we essentially run a platform that allows us to connect tutors and students together. And essentially at this stage, we're really just focused on growing the platform over the next few years. And yeah, that's a quick overview of what the company does. It's very much so focused on kind of the technological aspect and enabling us to really find the perfect match for students who are looking for some help with school.
Motivation behind it. What was the key motivation behind actually starting that? What did you just want to? Did you at one stage in med school think I don't want to do this for the rest of my? And it happens. It's not an uncommon. It happened with me at some point as well. I've changed my sort of career multiple times. But did you at med school just think I just want a level of freedom? Was it a gap in the market? What made you start a business like that?
I think it initially started off as just being able to learn something that's very different. And it started off, as I said, as an experiment. We didn't really have too many or any specific intentions of where the company might go. We just wanted to learn, try things out. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And it just happened to work quite well. We happened to continue investing into it, and it's thus grown to I guess bigger than we initially intended. Yeah.
And that's it's interesting. I just want to mention that to anyone who wants to start a business as well. Like, and at the start, is it safe to say you weren't buying Porsches and multi-million-dollar houses at the start? Is that a safe bet to say that?
No, and still no. Yeah.
That's a critical thing. I've started multiple online businesses, and I think the critical thing is you start with something that's of a little bit of interest, and you're happy to do that in your spare time. I think the critical thing would be you're happy to do that in your spare time without actually even being paid for it. It's something of interest that you do, because a lot of these startups do drain a lot of capital, not just money. I mean, in terms of the amount of hours that you need to do things, you face tons of problems. I think, is it safe to say that your job as an entrepreneur or a starter is primarily trying to fix things that you think would work, and it just nothing goes to the plan that you accept?
Yeah.
That sort of, I almost say that, successful entrepreneurs are the most unsuccessful people in the world because they've failed that many times and everything. Does that seem like a day in the life of KIS?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. At the end of the day, you're there to solve problems, and ideally hire the right people who can also solve problems. But the problems never really end.
Perfect. And in terms of that as well, are you guys hiring by any chance right now?
No, right now we're actually quite comfortable with the team size, and things are going smoothly, but we are always on the lookout for good tutors to join the platform.
Yep.
But internally, our team is small but quite strong. So we're keeping the internal team size steady, but we're always on the lookout for more tutors to apply.
Perfect. And if there's any tutors here listening to this, just check out the link at the bottom of this video, and there'll be a link on how you can apply. I'll get all those details off you, and we'll put that at the bottom of this video, so they can link in to have a look at that. Now, as part of that as well, I'm just being mindful of your time as well, so let's try and keep this to 5 minutes. As part of that hiring process, are there any real deal breakers? When you were hiring people, were there any deal breakers of people that just automatically get knocked out? So I send you a resume. Let's start with the resume process. What on a resume throws someone out the door?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, I think no matter what job you apply for, a resume is probably the first thing people look at. In some roles, there might be an application, but I think a resume is really the first thing that anyone takes a look at. And I think what really stands out is just lack of effort. You can tell when someone hasn't put any effort into making their resume, and that is an instant red flag. Remove the applicant. Don't bother interviewing them. I think that even if someone doesn't have too many things on their resume, or even if their resume might not be too extensive because they're a recent graduate, you can tell when they've put in the effort to build a resume and to at least try and impress you. And if there's no effort to try and impress you, then during the application process, and you can guarantee there won't be any effort to try and impress you when they're working for you.
Absolutely. And I think your application starts, I always tell everyone, the minute you start typing your resume up. If it looks like crap, don't just stop wasting it. Do something else, because you're not going to get anywhere with that. And I think that's a critical thing. Little things like spelling mistakes on resume will knock you out. We have spell checkers, we have Grammarlies, we have everything. Those things are very important. Make sure you've got consistency through your resume. Make sure the formatting looks okay. Look, now there are issues around applicant tracking systems and things like that, but you can still have a pretty elegant, professional resume that doesn't have all the bells and whistles that will get through things like applicant tracking systems, and it does stand out. So that's the first thing, get your resume right. Secondly, so you've got 10 resumes, you've thrown 5 in the bin, you're going to interview the top 3 that's left. The other ones you've kind of just wiped out. They walk into your office, or it's a Zoom meeting. What are the key red flags there? What is the first thing you kind of look out for? What's one thing that would just knock someone out straight away?
I think I'd always try and give people an opportunity. I tend to hire very young kind of team members because it's just the vibe of a company. So we tend to have people who might not have had a full-time or even a part-time job before, or people who might not be very experienced. I think the one thing that I really look for is almost like a drive or an obsession with the area that they're being hired for. So for example, if we're hiring a developer, we want to see that they've worked on personal projects that have nothing to do with uni or school, that kind of thing. If we're hiring someone who's a creative or a marketer, we want to see them show a good understanding of how paid advertising or marketing works. We want to see a creative portfolio. So I think that I tend to give people an opportunity no matter how our initial their initial presentation is, because hiring a marketer versus a developer, you're probably going to encounter very different personalities between those two roles. But at the end of the day, the consistency is really showing that they are interested and they love what they do. Because if they love what they do, then they'll enjoy the job that you're hiring them for as well.
Absolutely. And just to summarize that, would it be simple to say there is a deep passion for what they do? They would do that job even if they weren't being paid for it. I think there's a key difference between obviously working in a lot of corporates as well. There are a lineage of people who will rock up, they'll punch their ticket, they'll turn the computer on, they'll get their coffee, they'll have their chat, they'll send out a few emails, then go home. Yep. There is another lineage of people that will come in early. They're always looking stressed for some reason, working hard, they'll ask for more projects, they'll perform well, they will make mistakes, they will learn from it, but they generally progress a lot faster. And I think you do have a very, very, very opportunity, you have a big opportunity as an employer to find that person in the interview. You can tell the difference between those two employees pretty much.
It is definitely a bit of an art to kind of pick who is going to be that person. But as you do more and more hiring, you learn that art.
Absolutely. And so the other thing is, don't try and fake that in an interview. As you get more experienced people, by the way, just as an example, I once tried to lie in an interview early on in my career, probably 10, 15 years ago. I never got the job because they could just tell, because like a stupid grad coming out of school trying to make something up, it just doesn't wash. So don't try that. It doesn't work. To anyone who's ever trying to do that, I have heard anecdotal stories of it working, but they don't end well. Quick question on presentation. Is the way they present in terms of just, cleanly shaven, dress well, is that all things that you look at in your assessment? Or given that you do go for grads, do you give a little bit of leeway on that?
I think it depends on the job you're applying for. I think that I've definitely hired some people who might not be the most presentable, but are amazing at what they do. Perfect.
And can you just give us some insight on would that be more down your technical developer routes compared to your creative sort of flair routes? Is that a fair characterization?
It can be, but it really depends. At the end of the day, I try to kind of remove all of the other biases I may have and just try and focus on whether or not this person will excel in the job or the vacancy that I have for them. And if it's a clear yes, then I hire. If it's a clear no, then I don't. And if everyone who applies for a role is a no, then I simply don't hire for that role.
I just want to emphasize that point. Even though everyone says it's effectively a job seekers market out there, that doesn't mean that employers are looking to take substandard employees through that employment process, because they're going to have to work with you forever. Yeah. So I'm gonna try and be mindful of your time. So let me ask you one last thing, and which is always really, really important. What is a key thing that would effectively get someone across the line instantly when they come into your interview room? What's one key aspect that you would actually look for in someone?
I think that, so aside from passion for their role, I think the ability to explain and articulate what they've done in the past in detail. So for example, for a creative, being able to explain maybe a marketing campaign they've run and why they ran it, or for a developer, explaining something they've built in the past and really breaking down the technologies they've used. Really having that niche, deep nitty-gritty understanding of what they do is probably one thing that I look for, and will automatically get someone over the line and make them top 3 candidate for me when interviewing. It's not necessarily something that's a first impression. It's something that you have to dig for as an interviewer. But if a candidate shows it, then I'm almost guaranteed to take them to the next step or to hire them. Yeah, perfect. So I think the key takeaway there is know a little bit about the detail of the work that you've done and have that passion to know all the aspects of a job. A key thing with me as well when I'm hiring,
when I ask someone a technical question, not just how did you set the price on this, what factors did you take into account? Was it this level of customers? Was it the market? What's happening in the economy? Like, the more detail you can articulate to me about the way you came up with that, that will give me an answer on what you're doing. Now, I'm mindful that we're over the hour mark, and I'm respectful of your time, and I really appreciate everything that you've done, Manoj, coming on, imparting some of your wisdom. Now, question: how does anyone get in contact with KIS Academics? What's the website?
So it's kisacademics.com.
Yep.
And there's a multitude of ways they can reach out: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, quite a few different routes. But if they're looking to apply to be a tutor on the platform, or if they're looking for a tutor as a customer, they can reach out to us anyway.
Perfect. And what I'll do is I'll get you to send me all your contact details and your LinkedIn details and everything, and we'll put them all at the bottom of this video. So if anyone, get in touch with Manoj, find out everything. If you want to be a tutor, get in touch. It really will help someone else as well, and you can help yourself out a little bit as well. Impart some of that knowledge. And one of the key things that for everyone that's always important is that client-to-client interaction. So if you can train someone, you're going to be great in your career. So I really encourage everyone to get on track. Manoj, thank you for your time. I will let you go. I really appreciate everything that you've done. Are there any final comments or anything you would like to make?
I think we definitely have talked about quite a variety of things. At the end of the day, if we're really targeting kind of young applicants, the main thing is to definitely find what you're passionate about and then really work hard at it. And as we discussed, while your environment does play a big part, if you have a drive to excel and succeed, then no one can really stop you there.
Perfect. I think that's a great comment to end this on. So Manoj, thank you for your time, and I wish you the best of luck with everything you do.
Cool. Thanks, Taraka. Have a good night.
You too. Thanks. See ya.
Bye.
Bye. Hey guys, I hope my interview with Manoj was helpful for you. Now, if you've got an interview coming up or you're preparing for a job interview process, check out the link below. We go through the things you must prepare for, what you need to do with your fashion and your hygiene, the things you must prepare for and the things you must not say. Likewise, if you've got a missed call from a job recruiter, we go through what you need to prepare for before you call them back. So if that's of interest, check out the link below. Like always, best of luck with your career.